Thanks everybody for being here. What a joy to start Friday studying Torah with people all over the country, maybe all over the world. If you are so inclined, if you want to type in the chat where you're calling in from, that's always a fun way to start. And while I orient us, 5 screens worth of people, fantastic. So today, this Shabbat, we're reading Parashat Beshalach. And that's it. Our main story as Jewish people is Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. And that's this week. That's this Parsha. This is it. This, from that perspective, if this is the main story that we tell all the time, then this is our main Parsha of the Torah from that perspective. So I think it behooves us to actually dig into how it is, the mechanics of liberation. How does liberation happen? 210 years they were slaves. Some scholars like Shadal try to say that the enumerating of 430 years actually does count the entire time in slavery, but most of the tradition says that the 430 years includes way back from the birth of Isaac and the time, the premonition leading up to slavery, and it's 210 years in slavery. But even so, that's a long time. That's more than entire lifetimes. People born and died in slavery maybe couldn't have imagined things could be different, and then they were different. So how does it happen? So we're going to look at 3, well, if we get to them, 3 vignettes. Maybe we'll only get to 2. We'll see how the day goes. Vignettes from the Parsha. We'll try to unpack and look and see what we can understand about what we can understand retroactively from the telling at the end. So I'm going to share my screen, and I think we'll jump right in. All right. So, and I'll share in case anybody wants to open this up differently on your screen. If you want to manipulate it, oops. Stop the share for a second so I can open up the chat. And I'll put a link to the document in here. And if you want to open it up to enlarge it or anything like that, feel free. Okay, share screen. So the first thing I want to look at is right at the very beginning of our Parsha, the question of how the Israelites make it out, really, and who makes it out, and what's their emotional state. We see at the very beginning of the Parsha, this is chapter 13, verses 17 to 18 of the book of Shemot, and this is the way our Parsha begins. Now, or when it happened, that Pharaoh sent the people off, Vayhi Beshalach Paro, that's how our Parsha gets its name, Beshalach, in his sending them out. God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, which was closer, or perhaps because it was closer, Ki Karovhu. For God said, lest the people have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. Now, there are many, many questions about this passage, this verse itself. What do you mean? God wanted to send them by the way of the Philistines and only brought them the roundabout way out because of the fear of war. But so was the original plan not to have them go to Mount Sinai? I mean, they have to go roundabout to go to Mount Sinai. God had said earlier when at the burning bush that they're going to come back to this place in order to worship me. So there are a lot of questions about that. But bracketing all of those for a moment, verse 18 is should really pique our attention. So God led the people round about, Vayasev Elohim et ha'am, by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds, Derech Hamidbar Yam Suf. And the Israelites went up, Chamushim, out of the land of Egypt. Chamushim alu v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, perhaps you might be wondering, why does this translation leave in the word chamushim? That's not an English word. I don't know what that means. That's a good point. And that's exactly our problem. The word chamushim is an obscure word, and there's some dispute about what it means. What might this word actually tell us about the Israelites' emotional state? We've already seen that God is concerned that they're going to freak out and run back to Egypt if they see conflict. So what does that emotional clue open up for us, and how might solving this word of chamushim actually help us understand? What we're really getting at is when the Israelites are going free, if we were theater directors and we're staging this, is everything party? They're so excited to be out. Are they apprehensive? Are they grieving? Are they rejoicing? What is the state of the people? Is there bickering going on? How do we understand what their state was like? So let's start with the word chamushim. As is the way of Midrash, you trip over a textual peculiarity, and in the course of smoothing that out, you solve life problems. So the early classical Midrash, called the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, it's parallel to the Mishnah. It is one of the foundational classical Midrash works, and this is on most of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, brings two different interpretations of the word chamushim. The first one says chamushim means nothing other than armed. Ein chamushim ela mizuyanim. And it brings a reference to that, the book of Joshua, chapter 1, when God says, Atem ta'avru chamushim. In that context, it's really, or Joshua says to the tribes, it's really clear in that context that chamushim means armed, because he's sending them out into battle, into war. Similarly, 3 chapters later, in the book of Joshua, the children of Reuven, the children of Gad, and half the tribe of Menashe crossed over chamushim, armed, before the Israelites, as Moshe had spoken to them, around 40,000 armed men. So let's actually think about that for a couple of minutes. So if the word means armed, why do you think it's important to the Torah to mention that the Israelites left armed? Our parsha begins saying, first of all, God sent the people out. God didn't lead them the short way, saying, lest the people have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led them roundabout by way of the wilderness of reeds, and the Israelites went out armed out of the land of Egypt. I'm going to stop the share and open up for a couple of thoughts. If the word chamushim means armed, what's the point? Why is the Torah telling us that here? Any ideas? This is not a right or wrong answer. This is purely, and now there's no way to know the right or wrong answer. You've seen what we have, and now it's just a matter of trying to make reasonable sense out of it. What are some thoughts? Why would the Torah mention that they were armed? So Linda Berger writes, so that they would feel safe. Jeff, so they'd be ready for the future. Those are good answers to why they might be armed. Why do you think the Torah is mentioning here in this place that they were armed? Why not at the time of the splitting of the sea? Or why not defer it later for when Amalek attacks and they're going to battle? Oh, by the way, the Israelites emerged armed out of Egypt. It's not offering access. I'm sorry. I'll change those settings now. Thank you for that reminder. Restricted. Anyone with the link? Great. Okay, now it should be accessible. Joanne, why don't you unmute yourself and share a thought?
I'm not sure how to explain this rationally, but I have the sense that word armed, if that's what it means, is referring to the internal, emotional, spiritual state of this people wandering, that they felt defensive in themselves. And God taking them away from people who had physically attacked them forces that inside story to grapple with its own sense of defensiveness.
Thanks, Joanne. So this is an internal statement, maybe reading it Hasidically, psychologically. Now, part of what we have to grapple with there is that in the book of Joshua, it's pretty clearly physical weaponry, and the Midrash, the Mechilta, is learning the meaning of the word from that. So you have to make another step to say, we learn that chamushim means armed in the book of Joshua, and here in this context, it's actually referring not to physical armaments, it's a metaphorical use of the word. They are, that God is guiding them away from the most traumatic, scary kind of conflict into a roundabout way, but also has enabled them to have spiritual, emotional, psychological defenses to be ready. They're not totally vulnerable, because you might think that, well, if they're going to see war by the Philistines, they'll see other scary things elsewhere. So no, God has armed them in some way. Thank you. I'm noticing a couple of the comments in the chat. Let's see. Carol said, how would they get arms since they were slaves? Uriel says, never before heard of arming slaves. Well, they're not slaves now. They used to be slaves last week. Now they're not slaves anymore. Also never heard of slaves wandering around the desert without slavers telling them what to do. Remember, they, on their way out, they asked their neighbors and took the gold and silver and clothing, and their captors died at the sea, and now they're not slaves anymore. There is a technical question of if this means arms, where do they get them? The Torah told us about other things that they got, the gold and the silver and the fabrics. Should we just assume that when they took, reparations in that sloppy way from their neighbors, they had them turn over their weapons also, or were they fashioning weapons? I think that's a real problem with this interpretation of the word, is that given that the Torah pays so much attention to telling us what they brought out with them, where they get weapons from. So I think that is a real problem. Steve was the next hand I saw. You can, unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I haven't thought about this, but the only visual I have of them leaving Egypt was from the film The Ten Commandments, where but I'm just thinking the arm might be a state of mind, organized, and, not just a free-for-all. So when you think about an organized marching out, I also thought maybe like they're an army of God. So they're just kind of like more, as opposed to a free-for-all, everybody to themselves. To me, that might mean just a discipline, and they're organized as they're leaving. So that's my thoughts on what you had suggested.
Thanks, Steve. Ayala, last comment or question on this section, and then we'll go forward. And unmute yourself, Ayala.
There we go. So I was also thinking about the vessels, and not that they used them to turn them into weapons, but that they were not just a ragtag bunch of ex-slaves. They were coming out with some wealth. And so they were like standing proud and in a sense felt armed that way.
Yeah. So that could be an additional interpretation. The way that sometimes we use, like in English too, we'll use the word armed with in a metaphorical sense, armed with the relationships developed during the time spent living in this city. I decided to go back and start off on my own in a new career, armed with the knowledge gained during the master's degree. People do use it metaphorically, and it's possible that it means that. It sounds like this first view in the Mechilta doesn't think that. It sounds like this first view means weapons, because it's saying, like, look, in the book of Joshua, in these two places, it means weapons, and that's what it means. So that's what Chamushim means here. But I think you're right that the Hebrew might be able to sustain. It doesn't mean armed. It means packed. So you can pack heat, or you can pack other things. But if that's the case, then we wonder, why does it mention it here? We already know that they came out with the gold and the silver and the fabrics, and then they presumably picked up other things. If it means weapons, maybe, I mean, the question of where they got them is a real problem. There doesn't seem to have been time for them to smelt gold and silver into weapons and shape them. Remember, on their way out, they knocked on their neighbors' doors, grabbed their stuff, and then they ran. They couldn't even wait for their bread to rise. And this is like the same day or the next day. So it's a little hard to imagine how that happened. And I think that the Mechilta's suggestion is still difficult, which is why I appreciate some of the additional interpretations, like that it means packed with wealth and resources, or that it means packed with emotional resources. I'm going to share my screen again. We'll go back to the text, and I'll share what some of the commentaries who follow the Mechilta here says. I think the way you have to understand it in this literary context is saying God was like, oh, I better not send them by way of the Philistines because they're going to freak out when they see war. And then the next verse mentions that they had arms in order to really highlight their fragile emotional state. So, because it might be a no-brainer if you have a bunch of unarmed people walking, into a battlefild, to say that, like, well, of course they're going to freak out and want to go back where they came from. But it might heighten it to understand their emotional state if you say, like, God really had to change their itinerary, even though they were armed. They were armed, by the way. They weren't totally helpless and defenseless. They were armed, but they're feeling fragile. In other words, the point of this passage is God's insight that people are glad to be free, but they're not sure. There's a fear. It's like, everything I know is Egypt. And even though they have the physical means for their sustenance, and even though God is doing mighty miracles on their behalf, this is not an exuberant scene. It's actually a scene with maybe some nervous laughter, and the sign of conflict. They might turn around and go home. And in that way, it's a foreshadowing to some of the experiences coming up. The road to freedom is going to be rocky. And the Torah here is giving us some literary foreshadowing. Like, they're armed, they're ready, but it's still going to be, they're still fragile. So I think that's one little vignette, one potential insight into the emotional state of the Israelites. And if that's the case, I think that teaches us something about liberation movements now that we should be a part of. Maybe the Torah is modeling for us that you have to attend to fear, moving from what you know to what you don't know, even if you can objectively observe that what I know, whether I'm a winner or a loser in the situation that I know, what I know is a situation, is a setting in which many, many, many people are suffering and oppressed. And there should be an exodus from it. But we're likely to want to turn back and actually find comfort in the oppressive situations that we know. And that's even if we have the tools to transition. It's a hard transition to make. So I think that might be one lesson there. But there's another view in the Mechilta, just as some of you noted that, like, it's a little odd in this case to mean physical weaponry. Maybe it means these other things. One person, I forget who wrote in the chat, is the word chamush related maybe to chumash. And the second view in the Mechilta says, yes, chumash, in the way we use it to refer to the Torah, just means a fifth. Chamisha chumshei Torah, the 5/5 of Torah. The Torah is divided into 5 books. So a chumash is one of those 5. Now, we sometimes colloquially use it to refer to all 5 together, the 5 books. But chumash is a derivative of the word 5. Now, etymologically, it's possible that 5 is has a kind of like early round number kind of identity, that it's related to the word for armed. It's like you're up to the 5s or something. That's possible. I didn't really do the full etymological research. But let's look into the second view of the Mechilta, which will really help us understand something deep about the Exodus experience. Something else, Davar Acher. They went up Chamushim. That means 1 out of 5. Achad michamisha. Only 1 out of 5 Israelites made it out. 20% of the population made it out. Some say it was actually 1 out of Chamishim, 1 out of 50. Some say 1 out of every 500, Chamesh Meot. Rabbi Nehorai says, I swear, Ha'avodah, not 1 in 500 went up, but many of the Israelites died in Egypt. When did they die? During the 3 days of darkness. So according to this reading of the Mechilta, Pharaoh sends the people off, but God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, which was closer, for God said, lest the people have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness of the Sea of Reeds. And the Israelites went up. Only 1 out of 5 of the Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt. So let's stop and consider that reading for a second. What does that tell us about what we've been experiencing the previous couple of parshas and about the state of the Israelites here? Who are the people who are coming out? What have we seen? What does it mean to say that actually the majority of the Israelites didn't make it out? They didn't leave. They died during the plague of darkness with the Egyptians. They weren't ready to separate. God said, you stick to your own area, separate from the Egyptians, and you'll be safe. 80% of the Egyptians were sticking with Egypt, and they didn't make it out. What do you make of that? Arnold Block, does that mean the dead were left behind? That's explicitly what it means. Only 20% made it out. The others died during the plague of darkness. That's explicitly what the Midrash says. So what do you make of that? Nina, go ahead.
Nina, you should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, sorry. It makes me think of the corrosive long-term effects of being an enslaved human being and what it does to one spiritually, mentally, and physically. I put a comment in the chat about the kind of parallel to people who've been in prison a long time, and they come out, and some people can't make it. They can't make that transition. They don't want to make that transition. Slavery is incredibly infantilizing and brutalizing, and that brutality takes a terrible toll. And the integration, it's like if you're in a holding cell in the dark, and all of a sudden you come out into sunlight, it's physically painful to experience literally sunlight. And I think that might be the Torah's message, that there were just too many people who tragically couldn't stand straight after being bent so long. And they just died from kind of the inability to become human again, fully human again, which is a sort of double tragedy on top of the whole story, I think.
Thanks so much for that. Bob Goodstein, go ahead.
Bob, we can't hear you yet. Do you mind unmuting? You should have the ability now.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So my feeling is that God decided that only those strong enough to withstand the exodus from Egypt would make it. And I totally agree with what Nina said about that, they had been enslaved for 40 years and the bondage was extremely hard. And so in God's light, when they say 1 out of 50 or 1 out of 500, the Torah is telling us that you had to be really strong for God to let you come out of Egypt.
Thank you, Bob. Earl, go ahead. And then Esther Westelman.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had to click a couple of buttons there. I think we only need to look at Reconstruction in the United States to get a picture of what's going on here. So right after the Civil War, the freed slaves, many of them became members of Congress and acquired land and did a bunch of other things. And then the reaction in the South was mass murder of Blacks and others. And then even later on, I used to live in Richmond, Virginia, where there was a Monument Avenue to all the Civil War generals and a complete rewriting of history. So my interpretation is that they were definitely armed, and they were armed to the teeth because they needed to be. Otherwise, they would have been re-enslaved by people along the route.
Thanks, Earl. And so certainly we do see them having conflict with Amalek later on and so on. But not by the differences in your situation, in the example you're bringing up, the same people who were slavers were still on the loose. And then when the federal government pulled out, they were able to reinstitute white supremacy. But in our situation, they've literally seen their captors all dead on the shore. So they know that the Egyptians can't come back after them. So that is an important difference. But the general story that like this isn't just, there's no happily ever after, life continues to have conflicts, stands. Thanks for that. Esther Westelman, go ahead.
Okay, I agree with Nina for the second interpretation, 1 in 5. But as far as armed, I think we are people of action, and it's interesting that it comes around the Yam Suf. Nachshon had to step in. So this is what I call ba'am. We are people of action, and if we are religious, we say we are observant Jew. So this is our armament, that we are willing and prepared and ready to act.
Great, thank you, Esther. Yeah, I love that we've had so many other interpretations of what chamushim means here that are all viable. I do want to try to take seriously and understand the meaning suggested by Chazal here, which Rashi brings both of them. They're both very prominent in the sources, and make sure that we don't just gloss over, but really understand what they're trying to get at. So I want to share, like, when I first learned this midrash, even it's not obscure, Rashi cites it, but when I first encountered it in adulthood, the meaning of chamushim is that only 1 in 5 left. I remember feeling this really palpable shock and like the feeling of a bubble being burst, that I'd had this, image in my head, a kind of veneer of confident unity, on the story of an exuberant liberation narrative. And that realizing that that's just a veneer, and that underneath the surface was this bruised, divided, ravaged people. Only 1/5 of their ancestors made it out, at most. But as I thought about it and tried to make sense of whatever meager things I've learned about life and the world, and if we're taking this story seriously as something that teaches us about living in this world, it began to sink in that it really couldn't have been otherwise. I want to say this clearly: escaping oppression to freedom is a radical act. Emunah, faith, is a radical act. Collective organized action is a radical act. Most people aren't radical. Most people generally don't sign up for radical acts. The Torah wants us to be radical. The Torah wants us to sign up for radical acts. The Torah wants to radicalize us by having us go against the grain and believe in God even when the greatest dictator in the world says he's never heard of God. And to affirm that believing in God means affirming the opposite of the socio-political framework around us. when everything we know is an oppressive economic, political system, and that we are affirming the opposite. Let my people go to worship me. That's a very radical act. Most people generally don't sign up for that. And I can even understand this position that like, a fifth of them signed up. That's a lot. When have we ever seen 20% of a population be on board for this dangerous and this radical an act that requires suspending everything you know, everything that everybody else around you tells you, that everybody else is going to think that you're crazy? It probably wasn't even 1 in 500. And there's a certain way looking around the world that tracks. And I think the picture that really paints for life in Egypt beforehand, what's been going on in this past year. The Mishnah in Idiot does some calculation that it must have all transpired in less than 12 months, because Moshe had already just turned 80 when he arrived in Egypt, and he's 120 when he dies, and they're 40 years in the desert. So this must have been really just like less than 1 year, the whole period of the liberation and the plagues. And there was probably a lot of bickering in, like the barbershops and beauty salons of Goshen. Nah, this is nonsense. Come on. Like, where is it going to be? Well, you're going to leave it. Well, Pharaoh is just going to let us leave. Sure. Like, oh, come on. So there's some frogs everywhere. I've seen frogs worse than this in my day. Like the ways in which people rationalize all sorts of things out there, saying that then there are these radical crazies saying Hebrew lives matter, and actually asserting that freedom and liberation is real and palpable and could be upon us any moment. There's going to be a lot of controversy about that. And I think the lesson that teaches us is, if we want to take seriously being part of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which when we make Kiddush tonight, we will say that what we're doing is in commemoration of the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. If we're doing that, that means forming ourselves into people who are willing to really go against the socio-political grain, to be radical people in the radical belief in freedom and liberation and worship of Hashem. And that Hashem means Hashem who cares about the least of us, the widows and the orphans, so on. So I want to share another follow-up vignette from this Parsha that I think also, I'm not sure we'll get to the third one, but at least the second one, that I think gives us a little bit of an indication into how that might happen. What does it mean to live our lives? What are the practices that we have to cultivate in order to develop the spiritual radicalism that the Torah might be describing of the small minority of people who made it out? So I'm going to share my screen again. And, shortly after this, the beginning of the Parsha, there's the drama of the Egyptian army chasing after and coming close, and God sends a fire and a cloud in between them as a buffer to protect them, and then the people are freaking out, and God says, go in and split the sea. As Esther pointed out, the Midrash understands that they didn't all just jump in. There was a brave person willing to jump in before the water even receded, Nachshon ben Aminadav. That's not in the text of the Torah, but there's good reason psychologically to understand that they needed to witness somebody doing it. Be that as it may, sea splits, the people come through, and then the Egyptians run after them, and God restores the water and makes the Egyptian chariots in the sea especially confused, and they all drown. And the Israelites see them dead. And then they break into song. So here's how the Torah describes, in the aftermath of the recording of the entire poem, what might have been the triggering of the whole song. So then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and the word mecholot could mean dancing, with timbrels and dancing. It also could mean like percussive instruments that are used to prompt dancing, flutes, which is how the rabbis understand it. So I'm going to leave it translated as flutes for our purpose. So the women went after her with timbrels and flutes, percussive instruments, dance instruments. Today, the equivalent of like a turntable mix board, And Miriam prompted them, Shiru l'Adonai ki go ga'asus rafora mabayam, sing to Adonai, who is highly exalted, horse and rider is hurled in the sea. The Chizkuni, medieval commentator, points out that we should read that as a ... and the rest of the song, Miriam was prompting the women in the entire song. Whether this happened simultaneously to the men, after the men, before, there's a lot of questions of interpretation which are beyond our time frame for the next 9 minutes. The Midrash, the same Mechilta, asks an amazing question, the question that was implicit in our question when we interpreted chamushim to mean armed, and a bunch of you were quite rightly asking, where the heck did they get weapons? What? We didn't hear that they took silver and gold and fabrics and weapons from their neighbors. I can't imagine they had weapons when they were slaves. They were slaves just yesterday, so how did they get weapons all of a sudden? And maybe that's part of what animates not reading it to mean weapons, but reading it to mean 1/5. Here too is another object. We know they ran out, couldn't even wait for their bread to rise. The only thing they did was ask their neighbors for these specific things, gold, silver, and fabrics. So the Midrash asks, where did the Israelites get timbrels and flutes in the desert? That's a big plot problem. So the Midrash answers, rather, righteous people, or in Rashi's quoting of this Midrash, righteous women were confident and knew that the Holy Blessed One was doing miracles and mighty things for them. And at the time they were leaving Egypt, they constructed timbrels and flutes. Timbrels and flutes. I want us to stop and think for a minute. We'll have some comments, reactions, reflections. But, they left the night of the beginning of the 15th of Nisan, in the dead of night. But we know that from last week's Parsha, God gave them instructions for the departure 2 weeks earlier on Rosh Chodesh. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, chapter 12 of Exodus. This new moon should be the beginning of months where you start counting time. In 9 days, take a goat, and then 4 days after that, slaughter it and make sure you're all together and hear all the rules. I'm not going to give you the rules again on the day of. I'm telling you now ahead of time. That's a real, sort of social sifting factor. At that point, 9 plagues in, Egypt is in free fall. The economy is collapsed, rampant death, flocks are gone, animals have been killed off. People have been dying in these plagues. It's been an utter horror show of several months of these 9 plagues. And just an obstinate leader at the top. Even the elite has started to turn on Pharaoh at that point and said, what, we can't, all the magicians, we can't keep up with these people. What's wrong with you? So in that period of 2 weeks, they had already stopped actually enslaving them because the Egyptian economy had collapsed. What was it like in Goshen, in the Israelite communities? What were they talking about? What were they doing? And I think there are a few important lessons about freedom from here. One is that liberation requires celebration. We have to be hard and sometimes morbid and move to the next challenge. But there's a time you also have to bust out the instruments and sing and dance. We celebrating partial victories. The Exodus, crossing the sea, is only a partial victory. They're still not secure. They don't know their food source. In 3 days, they're going to have a major water crisis. It's a partial victory. You have to celebrate partial victories. And the women knew that. 2 is that liberation, as we discussed, is radical and it requires confidence and faith. And most of the Israelites were naysayers, sellouts, probably mocking the radicals, the liberationists. And yet, some of them these women had the confidence to prepare for triumph. And, maybe they were helped to build up that confidence by being told that they're going to walk up to the capitulating enslavers and say, give us your stuff. But the other thing is that liberation requires preparation. People who show up in a protest movement have been working at it for months and years so that they're at the ready when the moment comes. The Midrash could have said that they brought instruments that they already had, that had instruments all this time, or they could have said that they took them from the Egyptians with the gold and silver and fabrics. But no, they made them. So during those 2 weeks of counting and waiting, after they've been told the data would go down, we can imagine the Israelite community having this loud, contentious discourse. No, this is really happening. It's all going to change. Oh, come on, nothing's going to change. This is nothing. That dark was just because it was cloudy. It wasn't a big deal. People are going to rationalize. And the women sat down and got to work. I don't know exactly when we're going to play these, but when we'll know, and we have to be ready. Real swagger plans ahead. And Miriam and the righteous women teach us that liberation is a practice, it's a discipline, that spontaneous expression is fueled by preparation. There is no spontaneous expression that doesn't come through meticulous preparation, the preparation of sewing, of flattening a skin, of drying it out. All of these things take time and focus. Before they're free with just some skins and reeds around, the righteous women see abundance where other people see scarcity. We have nothing. We're a bunch of slaves. The righteous women see abundance. These are going to be instruments of our liberation. They make something out of nothing. You don't wait for a big NGO to come and solve things. The people who are directly oppressed have everything that they need for their own liberation, and devoting the careful, caring attention of the disciplined practice of faith is the stuff of liberation. And when the moment comes, they don't just express their readiness, but they bring everybody else along. Maybe other people who weren't ready, who weren't participating all this time. Maybe people who are doubters, who had a lot of voices in their head saying, this is nothing. Let's leave 2 minutes for some comments and reactions and questions, starting with Martha Hirsch. Go ahead.
Just one comment. Somebody wrote that Hebrews were enslaved for 400 years. In reality, I don't know if it is 17 years, but not 400. And
210 is the number that the rabbinic tradition settles on. The 400 starts from the birth of Yitzhak in most rabbinic countings, and the number most rabbinic sources discuss the actual time of slavery is 210 years.
Yeah, other sources said it's a lot less, but that's all I want. That's one of the things I just wanted to clarify. The other thing is that the musical instruments for Jewish people, they were not Jews, but Hebrew music has been very important, and having those little bit of those instruments in your home would be not unusual. So for me, there is no problem with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Go ahead, Ellen. Can I unmute yourself, Ellen? While you're getting ready to unmute yourself, I'll answer Martin's question. There are no population records for Israelites who left Egypt. There's zero archaeological or similar evidence that there was such a thing as a slavery or a mass exodus. All we have is our literary memory. Go ahead, Ellen. Yeah, some people. Yeah, go ahead.
It seems we lost Ellen, so I don't know if you want to leave us with a closing thought, Rabbi.
Great, so I'll leave with a closing thought. A couple of people commented that it doesn't seem so surprising that they would have had instruments. that should be all the more reason why it's striking when the rabbis teach us that these were newly constructed instruments made for liberation. That's a real insight. They have easier options. They could just say, yeah, the Torah never mentioned when it tells us what they took, that they also took their instruments, their stuff. But they did. That would be a reasonable thing that we would believe. Or if they said, when they took gold and silver and fabrics from their neighbors, that was just for example. They took other stuff too, including instruments. Those are options. And the rabbis are saying, no, I think if we want to make sense of how liberation happens, liberation only happens when there is a countercultural radical group of believers who have a disciplined preparatory practice. And I think we can imagine a lot of people looking at Miriam and her sisters and comrades being like, what the heck are you guys doing? Why are you sewing now? Why are you making drums? Saying, we're about to be free and we're going to have to celebrate. We're going to be free from what are you talking about? There's a sea over there. Where are we? You believe this Moses schnook? Like, come on, we're not going anywhere. They have to listen to all that stuff. And meanwhile, they just keep sewing. Yeah, I know it's coming. And like, tune out all the haters and the naysayers. And I think the same is true for us as we pay attention as people who are animated by this parsha to be liberationists. That takes ongoing, everyday work. And even if the majority of people, 80% of people around us, say that this is nonsense, to have the fortitude, the groundedness, and the disciplined practice to know that in order to be ready for serendipity, to be ready for spontaneity, I need a disciplined practice, the practice of the law, the practice of disciplined spirituality and radicalness. And I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to Mara for announcements and wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. We will send out the source sheet and the recording of this class, and we hope to see you next week. Bye-bye, everyone.